Vivid verses.
I had been with Camille for 2 years and 4 months on a Thursday. She told me she was pregnant. I know it was a Thursday because I had just come off a 12-hour shift at the fabrication plant where I run quality control for the second line. I know it was Thursday because I had traded my Wednesday off with a coworker named Pete so he could take his daughter to a specialist 2 towns over, which meant I had worked 9 consecutive days by the time I pushed through her front door at 7:40 p.m. and found Camille sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded and a look on her face I had not seen before. There was a glass of water in front of her. Not wine. Not the iced tea she made in big batches on Sundays. Water. That's deliberate. I set my bag down by the door the way I always do. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink the way I always do. I asked her how her day went, which is what I always do, and she said, "I need to tell you something," which is not what she always does. She told me she was pregnant. I stood at the sink with water still running over my wrists, and I processed the information the way I process most information, quietly, completely, without performing a reaction before I had one. I thought about the apartment we were renting, which had 2 bedrooms, one of which we used for storage and her painting. I thought about the $4,200 I had in savings, which was not enough and was also not nothing. I thought about my mother, who had raised my brother and me largely alone and who had done it well, which meant it was possible. I thought about whether I loved Camille, not as a question with doubt in it, but as a calculation that needed to be run cleanly. I did. I do. I was not uncertain about that. I turned off the water. I dried my hands. I walked to the table and sat down across from her. She was watching me the way people watch something they're not sure will hold. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." I said, "I'm in." We figured out together. What happened to her face then, the loosening of something that had been wound very tight, is not something I'll describe in detail, because it was private and it was real, and at the time I believed it entirely. She reached across the table and took both my hands. She said she'd been terrified to tell me. She said she wasn't sure how I'd react. She said she loved me. I said I loved her. We sat there for a long time. I believed all of it. I had no reason not to. Over the next 3 weeks, I did the things a person does when they're preparing for a child. I pulled up my benefits paperwork and confirmed the health insurance situation. I called my brother Theo and told him. I started looking at the storage room with different eyes, measuring, calculating, thinking about what would need to move and where. On a Saturday, I drove 40 minutes to a larger hardware store and spent $180 on paint samples because Camille had mentioned once, months ago, that she'd always wanted a yellow nursery, and I had remembered that. I came home with 11 sample cards in different shades of yellow and taped them to the wall so we could see how they looked in the morning light. I was carrying this forward with both hands. I was not hedging. That's the part that matters for what comes next. I found out on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the kitchen table conversation. Camille's younger sister, Renata, called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She called my cell, not the house line, which I noted. Her voice had that particular quality of someone who has been carrying something uncomfortable and has finally decided to set it down regardless of where they're standing. She said, "I think I messed up. I said something to Cam this morning, and she got really upset with me, and I think you should know something." I said, "Tell me." Renata said that the test had been staged. That Camille had shown her the test 3 weeks ago with a positive result. That Renata had helped her plan how to tell me. That the test itself, the physical object, had been ordered online. That there was no pregnancy. That Camille had wanted to know, in Renata's words, if he'd step up or disappear. I was in the break room at the plant when Renata told me this. It was 2:17 p.m. There were 2 other people in the room. I watched one of them stir his coffee. I watched the other one check his phone. The refrigerator made its small, continuous hum. I said, "Thank you for telling me, Renata." She said, I'm so sorry. I didn't think it would go this far. I said, I know. Take care of yourself. I hung up. I finished the last 20 minutes of my shift. I drove home. I made dinner, pasta, the simple kind, nothing that required attention. I ate at the counter because Camille was visiting a friend and wouldn't be back until 8. I cleaned up. I watched an hour of television. I went to bed. I did not call anyone. I did not compose a message. I did not plan a speech. I just let it settle the way you let concrete settle. Not because you're comfortable with it, but because disturbing it too early ruins the structure. There is a version of me that does not sleep tonight. I'm choosing not to be him. On Wednesday, I went to work. I ran quality control on the second line. I caught a calibration drift on one of the measuring arms at 10:45 a.m. and corrected it before it affected the afternoon batch. I ate lunch with Pete, who told me his daughter's appointment had gone well. I said I was glad. I'm in it. After work, I went to the grocery store. I bought food for the rest of the week. I came home and I put it away. I changed out of my work clothes. I sat down in the chair across from the couch where Camille was watching something on her laptop, earbuds in, not yet noticing I was there. I watched her for a moment. She looks relaxed. She hasn't been waiting. She doesn't know Renata called. I said her name. She looked up, pulled one earbud out, and gave me the easy smile she gives me when I interrupt something she doesn't mind being interrupted from. I said, I know. What I want to understand is why you felt you needed to do that. The smile stopped. Not dramatically, it just stopped the way a clock stops, one moment running and the next moment not. She said, what? I said, I know about the test. I want to understand why. She's calculating whether Renata told me. She's deciding whether to deny it. I can see both calculations happening. I'll wait. She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at her hands. Then she looked back at me. And then she told me. It took about 40 minutes. I let her talk without interrupting. She talked about the relationship before me. A man named Garrett who had disappeared when she told him she thought she might be pregnant, who had stopped returning calls inside of a week, who she had never fully believed had been real until he wasn't there anymore. She talked about what that had done to her understanding of commitment. She talked about watching her parents' marriage collapse when she was 16 and the specific, quiet way her father had been present for years without actually being there. She talked about the test like it was a small thing. She talked about my reaction to the test like it was the only thing. She said, I just needed to know if you were really in. That's all. Don't make it bigger than it is. There it was. She's asking me to shrink what she did so she can keep what she found out. That's the negotiation. That's what I'm looking at. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not nod in a way that meant I agreed. I did not fill the silences she left. When she was finished, I said, thank you for telling me the truth. She said, so we're okay? I looked at her for a moment. I said, I need a few days. I went to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I thought for a long time, not about whether I was angry, I already knew I was, but about what the anger was actually pointing at. Anger is information. I have learned to treat it that way. What she built was a test she couldn't fail. If I left, she was right about me. If I stayed, she kept the result and never told me I earned it under false conditions. Either way, she wins information. Either way, I lose the choice. That's not a small thing. That is not something I can make smaller just because she needs me to. I made my decision before I fell asleep. Not in anger. In clarity. I know what I'm doing. I know why. I'll execute it carefully. The audit, when I ran it properly, took about an hour. I sat at the kitchen table Friday morning while Camille was at work, and I went through it the way I go through a quality control checklist. Not to punish, but to understand exactly what I was working with. Item 1. I had traded my Wednesday off, 9 consecutive days of work, and come home to that conversation still willing to sit down and be present. That was not nothing. That was a choice made in good faith on a body that was tired. Item 2. the $180 in paint samples, 40 minutes of driving, the act of remembering something she had said months ago and treating it as real. I had taped them to the wall. They were still there. Item 3, the benefits review. 45 minutes on hold with HR to confirm dependent coverage. I had the notes in my work bag. Dated 3 weeks and 1 day ago. Item 4, the conversation with my brother Theo. I had told him. Theo had responded with genuine happiness, had started talking about being an uncle, had asked when the due date was. I had given him a due date because Camille had given me one. I would now have to call Theo and unwind that conversation. Item 5, the storage room. I had spent time in there. I had moved 3 boxes. I had measured the window for blackout curtains because she had mentioned once that babies needed darkness to sleep, and I had filed that away and acted on it. I had not mentioned this to her because I had not needed credit for it. It was just something I was doing. Item 6, 3 weeks of silence about every reservation I might have had. Because when you tell someone you're in, you're in. You don't perform doubt. You don't hedge out loud. I had carried this fully, and I had not asked for acknowledgement, and she had been the only one in those 3 weeks who knew it was a test, which meant she had watched me do all of it with that knowledge and said nothing. She watched. The entire time she watched. I did not list these things to build a case against her character. I listed them to understand clearly what had been taken. Not money, not time exactly, but something harder to name. The specific weight of acting in good faith. The cost of being, without reservation, exactly who you said you were. I arrived at the decision not as a punishment, but as a necessary correction. She wanted to know if I was really in. Now I need to know something too, and I won't fake the test. That weekend I began. I did not announce what I was doing. I did not explain my plan. I simply began making changes, one at a time, the way you correct a calibration drift, targeted, measured, documented. The paint samples came off the wall on Saturday morning. I did it before she woke up. When she came into the kitchen and noticed the bare patches on the wall where the tape had been, she stopped. She said, "You took them down." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" She knows why. She's asking because she wants to hear me say something emotional. I won't. I said, "They were for a nursery. We don't need them." I said it the way you state a fact. No edge, no weight, no invitation to argue. She stood there for a moment. Then she poured her coffee and didn't say anything else. That afternoon, I called Theo. I made the call in the bedroom, door open, not hiding it. Theo picked up on the second ring, and I told him what had happened in plain, factual language. I told him there was no pregnancy. I told him the test had been staged. I told him I was handling it. Theo is not a dramatic person, but the silence that came through the phone before he responded told me he understood the weight of it. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Figure out what's real." When I came back to the living room, Camille was sitting on the couch. She had heard enough. She said, "You told your brother." I said, "He needed to know the same thing I needed to know." She said, "You're punishing me." First accusation. She's reframing the consequences as cruelty so she can position herself as the victim. Note it. Don't engage it. I said, "I'm not punishing you. I'm being accurate." She started to say something else, and I picked up my book and I read. Not rudely, not as a performance. I simply returned to what I had been doing because I had said what I needed to say. Monday, I moved the boxes back into the storage room. Every box back to where it had been. I did not make noise about it. I did not make it an event. I just moved them and closed the door. Tuesday evening, I called HR back and removed the dependent coverage review from my file. Told them I'd reached out prematurely and to disregard the inquiry. The woman I spoke to was professional and asked no questions. I thanked her and hung up. Every action I took in those 3 weeks was an action I took for a real future. I'm not going to carry infrastructure for a future I was never actually offered. Wednesday, I told Camille that we needed to pause discussions about moving to a larger apartment. We had been casually looking, nothing signed, nothing formal, but we had been looking. I told her I was not ready to make long-term housing decisions while I was still processing what had happened. I said at the dinner table, matter-of-factly, like a scheduling update. She put her fork down. She said, "So what? We're just in limbo." I said, "We're in the same place we were before the test." "That's not limbo. That's where we actually are." She wanted me to reassure her that the limbo is temporary. "I don't know that yet. I won't say something I can't verify." She said, "I told you everything. I explained it. What more do you want from me?" I said, "Understanding is not the same as resolution. I understand what you did and why you did it. That's step one." She stared at me. She said, "You're different." I'll let that sit for a moment. I said, "I'm clear. There's a difference." She means I'm frightening her. She means I'm not performing reassurance. She means she expected her explanation to resolve this, and it didn't, and she doesn't know what to do with that. I know. I'll let her work through it. The following Saturday, her friend Daria came over. Camille had told Daria some version of events because about an hour into their visit, Daria said she needed to use the bathroom and came through the kitchen where I was doing the dishes and stopped. She said quietly, "Is it as bad as she's saying?" I said, "Define bad." Daria looked at me for a moment. Then she said she made a mistake. I said she did. Daria said, "She's scared." I said, "I know." There was a pause. She started to say something else. I said, gently, "She'll be okay, Daria. You can go back in." Daria went back in. I finished the dishes. Daria came in here to advocate. She left having understood this is not a situation that requires an advocate. That's fine. She's a good friend. She's working with what she has. The call started on the following Monday. Daria called first on her own officially. She said Camille was really struggling and she wanted me to understand the context, the the trust issues, the fear. I listened. She talked for 6 minutes. When she finished, I said, "Did she tell you what she did in those 3 weeks while I was preparing for a child that didn't exist?" Silence. "Daria, did she tell you that part?" Daria said, "She said she watched you." I said, "She watched me for 3 weeks. Moving boxes. On the phone with my brother. Reviewing my health insurance. She watched all of it, and she didn't say anything." "Did she tell you that?" Daria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, she didn't tell me that part." I said, "Thank you for calling. Take care of yourself." Camille's friend Portia called that evening. Portia was more direct. She said she thought I was being cold and that people who'd been hurt in the past sometimes did things that didn't look rational from the outside. I let her finish. Then I said, "Did she tell you she ordered the test online?" Portia stopped. I said, "It wasn't an impulse. There's a purchase record. She planned it. Did she tell you that?" Portia said no. I said, "Thank you, Portia." Wednesday afternoon, my coworker Sheila, who knew Camille through a mutual friend and had met her at a work barbecue, found me in the break room and said she'd heard things weren't great at home and that she hoped I was keeping perspective. I appreciated the concern. I let her talk. When she finished, I asked, "Did anyone mention that I told my brother he was going to be an uncle?" Sheila looked at me. I had to call him back and take that away. "Did she mention that part?" Sheila said she didn't know. I said, "Okay. Thanks, Sheila." Thursday, Camille's cousin Ray, who I had met twice, called my cell at 9 in the morning. He had clearly rehearsed. He said that Camille was family to him and that what I was putting her through seemed disproportionate and that maybe I should think about what I actually had before I threw it away. I listened. Ray is 24 and loves Camille and was doing the thing you do when you love someone. I did not hold it against him. When he finished, I said, "Ray, did she tell you that for 3 weeks, while she knew the truth, she watched me build a nursery and didn't say a word?" Ray said, "A nursery?" I said, I taped paint samples to the wall. For the baby's room. Yellow. She mentioned it once, months ago. Did she tell you about the paint samples? A long pause. Did she tell you about those, Ray? He said quietly, no. I said, I know you love her. Thank you for calling. Friday evening, Camille's friend Becca, the one I had always liked best out of her group, steady and fair-minded, sent me a text asking if she could call. I said yes. She called within 2 minutes. She said, I'm not calling to defend her. I'm calling because I want you to know that what she did wasn't okay, and I told her that. That's different. I said, I appreciate that, Becca. She said, she told me about the paint samples. I said, okay. She said, she cried when she told me. She said she didn't realize how much you had. She said she didn't realize. I'll let that sit. She's from Camille's corner, and she's telling me this. That means the story Camille is telling is starting to include the real version. That's not nothing. That's something. I said, thank you for being honest with her. Becca said, for what it's worth, I think she knows she got it wrong. Not just the test. All of it. I said, I know. That's what I'm waiting to see. I said it without heat. Becca was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I've never heard you talk like this. I said, I haven't needed to before. She said softly, that tracks. We ended the call. Becca is the person Camille trusts most. If Becca is saying this, Camille's internal story is shifting. She's not circling the wagons anymore. She's starting to see what I actually see. That's the thing I've been waiting for. I did not let it show on my face. I finished my evening the same way I had finished every evening that week, methodically, cleanly at my own pace. That Saturday, Camille tried one more time. She came and found me in the backyard, where I was doing the small maintenance things the weekend demands, checking the gutters, replacing the worn-out spigot gasket I'd been putting off. She stood at the edge of the patio. She said, her voice sharper than it had been, I have apologized. Multiple times. I have explained. I have sat here while you systematically undid everything you did for 3 weeks and did not say a word. I have watched you give everyone the version that makes me look like a monster. What do you want? Just say it. What is it going to take? There it is. She's not asking what she needs to do. She's asking me to set a price so she can decide if she wants to pay it. That's still transactional. That's still not it. I looked at her from across the patio. I said, I don't want anything from you, Camille. I want to know who you are. She said, you know who I am. I said, I thought I did. Now I need to see it again. Clearly, without the test, without the management. Just what you actually do. She stood there for a long time. I went back to the spigot. 11 days later, Camille's transformation began. Not as a speech. Not as a grand gesture. It began the way real things begin, quietly, in small specific actions that accumulated into something I could not dismiss. She started with the things she had been avoiding. For 8 months, she had been saying she would call her therapist back, Dr. Harmon, who she'd seen briefly 2 years ago and whom she had stopped seeing without explanation. She made the appointment. I knew because she told me at breakfast, matter-of-factly, in the same tone I'd used to tell her about the housing discussions. She said, I have an appointment with Dr. Harmon on Thursday. I said good. That was the whole conversation. She called her mother. This was not a small thing. Camille and her mother had been managing a careful, surface-level relationship for years. They spoke, but they did not speak. The call lasted 2 hours. Camille took it in the bedroom with the door closed and came out looking like someone who had been through something. She didn't tell me what was said. She didn't need to. I had heard enough of the tone to know it was real. She deleted the account on the website where she had purchased the test. She showed me the confirmation email without being asked. She placed her phone face up on the table, turned it so I could read the screen, and said, I don't know if this matters. I'm showing you anyway. It matters. She wrote a letter to Renata, handwritten, which Camille almost never does. She left it on the kitchen counter unsealed and went to work. I did not read it, but she left it unsealed, and that was its own statement. She took over the grocery shopping, not as a performance. She had always contributed, but she had defaulted to me on logistics, particularly for the things that required planning ahead. She started keeping a list on the refrigerator. She started coming back from the store with things I hadn't asked for, but that were in the cabinet when I needed them. She took the storage room. This was the most specific change. She came to me one Sunday morning and said she wanted to empty it out, not as a nursery, just as a proper functional room, and she wanted to do the work herself. She moved every box. She patched the wall where a shelf bracket had pulled loose. She did it over 2 days methodically, without asking for acknowledgement. I came to the door of the storage room on the second evening and looked at what she had done. She was standing in the middle of the empty room, hands on her hips, looking around. I said, "You patched the wall." She said, "You mentioned it back in November." I remembered. That's a callback. She's using the specific language I used without labeling it. She's showing me she understood. Becca called me the following Wednesday. She said she had had lunch with Camille and that Camille seemed different. I asked her to be more specific. She said, less defended, like she stopped waiting for the verdict and started doing the work. She said, "How long does this take, do you think?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "The changes have been fast." I said, "Fast isn't the point. Real is the point." A week after the storage room, Camille and I were sitting at the kitchen table. It was a Sunday evening. There was food between us. It was a quiet meal, comfortable in the way meals can be when two people have stopped performing around each other. She said, without looking up from her plate, "You were really in." I said, "I know." She said, "I was right about that. I just went about it completely wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "I just needed to know if you were really in." She paused. I had to do it the hard way. There it is. The echo. She's using her own words back on herself. She knows what she did, and she's not dressing it up. I put my fork down. I looked at her. I said, "The hard way cost me something. I need you to know that." She said, "I know." I said, "Not as an accusation. As information." She nodded. She held my gaze in the way people hold your gaze when they're not trying to win anything, when they're just there, present, without an agenda. We finished dinner. I cleared the table. She washed the dishes. We did not fill the silence with anything. This is the version of her I was waiting to see. Not because she changed everything fast, but because the changes are pointing somewhere. Because the test she ran on me cost her something too, and she's starting to understand what it cost, and she isn't asking me to minimize it. That matters. That is the only thing that matters. Here is what I know, sitting with it now. A test only measures the moment it's given. It cannot measure what someone would have done tomorrow, or next year, or when things got genuinely hard. When you stage the conditions, you contaminate the result. You find out if someone performs well under false pretenses, and you learn nothing about who they actually are. She wanted to know if I was really in. I was. The test told her that. But the test also told me something. It told me she believed she needed a controlled experiment to know something true about me, which meant she had decided she could not trust what she was seeing with her own eyes. That is not a small thing. That is not something you make smaller just because the person asks you to. What she did, in the end, was not run the experiment and then wait. She ran the experiment, confirmed her hypothesis, and then started building a life on information she had gathered by deception. She was going to keep the result. She was never going to tell me. If Renata had not called, we would still be here, and I would still be the man who passed her test, and she would be the only one who knew the test had happened. That is the thing I could not make smaller. What redeemed it? What redeems her is not the speed of the changes or the specificity of the apologies. It is that when she finally saw the full shape of what she'd done, she did not try to argue with it. She did not ask me to weigh her past against her behavior. She simply started doing the work of being, without management, exactly who she said she was, which is all I had ever asked of her, which is all any of us can do for each other. Finally, show up completely in conditions we didn't design and be real. She set her fork down at the end of that last dinner, looked at me, and said, "I just needed to know if you were really in." And then, quietly, she said, "I was wrong to need it that way." That was the answer, not the apology before it, not the storage room, not the therapist appointment. That sentence, "I was wrong to need it that way," was the thing I've been waiting for, because it was the only sentence that was completely true and asked for nothing back. I heard it. I filed it. I moved forward.
Thanks for listening.